Before the game starts, all audience members are asked to mute their mics. Do not mute, and you disturb the speaker, we will have to remove you from this room.
Am I audible?
Loud and clear, Wafee.
All right, starting in a bit.
This House acknowledges and thanks the Prime Minister for this and invites the leader of Opp to take the stage. Here. Hello, the floor is yours.
Hello, can I be heard?
Clear?
All right, wonderful. My internet isn't that great, so in the case that I disconnect, is it okay if you guys pause, like if I stop talking for more than 5 seconds? Thank you.
Yes. If you can talk for 5 seconds, I will talk.
All right. All right, I'm gonna start now. Opposition is simple. We think that we support representative democracy, which means that we can still have consultation with a lot of these smart policies that the opening government wants, but at the final decision is still up to democracy and whether or not popular opinion is going to be able to decide for it. I'll have 2 responses to Wafee, and then I'll respond to the rest of it within my arguments. So, number 1, I think public health crises are incredibly complex. They have a lot of factors, and the fact that they are only allowing few organizations to be able to handle the multitude of factors makes it absolutely impossible to account for a lot of it. Take note, he only mentions economists in the middle of his speech. These are things that are incredibly complex, and I think it is only democracy where politicians, the incentive for things like keeping popularity, are willing to bring up a lot of issues that are much more difficult in the long term and trying to deal with a lot of the unheard solutions, a lot of the unheard problems that are much less likely to be heard when technocratic governments are unaccountable and have difficulty dealing with these different aspects. But secondly, he names a lot of unpopular decisions. Take note, a lot of his examples are things already being done by governments precisely because they are popular in trying to maintain and stop the spread of the disease. It is absolutely necessary for these people to react quick. So things like government slowdown might defend things like the government having increased power, but not changing the leadership that exists at hand. So I don't understand as to why this necessitates the policy, and I'm going to prove 3 things. Number 1, why technocrats have perverse incentives to keep policies inaccessible. 2, why this harms our ability to deal with current crises. And lastly, why it harms our ability to prevent future crises. Number 1, why do technocrats have perverse incentives? I think it is mere assertion that they say they only care and genuinely want to do good. I want you to assess all of the non-democratic governments that are currently responding. I would say that they have a lot of dangerous incentives or are simply not informed about a lot of the plights of poor individuals or middle-class individuals because they are not likely to be able to see these things on a day-to-day basis, given these are people who are like the elite, likely are the higher up the university education ladder. What are examples of these? Number 1, I'd say they have a revolving door. A lot of the top economists and people who are already appointed to a lot of economical institutions are people who are also interested in being starting to work as financial analysts for JP Morgan and having future private corporations. And I'd say there are different responses that you can take, but a lot of them can be inaccessible and can be anti-poor, but can look like you're solving the disease because they cater towards particularly large institutions. What are examples of this? The US Fed, which is an appointed government, by the way, precisely just bailed out big businesses for $1.4 trillion. But it was only after significant backlash towards Donald Trump that he did things like try to lower debt for smaller businesses, try to do things like freeze rent. I would say democratic policies are far more likely to listen to the wills of the masses versus the wills of things like private corporations. I think if you're interested in wanting to work at Johns Hopkins, you're much more likely to do things like try to protect patents even at the time of disaster, even if that slows down your ability to do things like produce a vaccine. So I think they have to prove that these people are absolutely always benevolent, not that they have their own inner interest in trying to go private or in trying to maintain their high position, especially because these are people who are unaccountable. The world can hate them, but it's not like that changes the ability of a corporation to hire them. Secondly, I'd say this harms our ability to deal with the current crisis. Why? I'd say a lot of the methods of dealing with the current crisis, like social distancing, trying to lock down or quarantine yourself, require and depend heavily on the amount of buy-in that individuals have to the policies that are being upheld. But if they are done by governments that they feel didn't vote in, they feel didn't have the mandate, then it's much less likely you follow a lot of these things for many reasons. One, I'd say there's existing animosity. The fact that these are probably elite, out-of-touch individuals, or at least can be looked to be deemed so. Two, look at their model. It's the UN. It's the WHO. These are Western impositions on a lot of countries and therefore unlikely to be respected and listened to. Lastly, politicians who were kicked out of office have the active incentive to blame everything on them, to build distrust and therefore go for re-election once this crisis is over. I would say you're far less likely to implement a lot of necessary actions that require significant amount of individual self-policing, have more people going out, have more people riot. In fact, in Hubei, when the government absolutely imposed, because they're undemocratic, like incredibly high prices on food, I think what that did was cause the riot and therefore only spread the amount of existing corona cases because there were massive social gatherings that were existing and people were leaving lockdown areas because they didn't feel like they had a say as to what was going on, especially in a time of crisis. This kind of distress is absolutely necessary. I don't care how good your policies are. If people are unwilling to follow them or unwilling to feel that their mandate exists, they're unlikely to be particularly successful. So I don't think that's likely to work. Thirdly, I'll say it harms your ability to deal with a future crisis. Before I move on, OG.
I mean, all the harms that you're talking about, a lot of these governments, especially the ones in America, have been elected on the back of these corporations. So these harms apply to you as well, right?
So I think it is particularly important that we have significant backlash from non-corporate individuals to be able to counteract that versus your world where these people have absolutely no say in anything. And here's the third thing I want to talk about. Let's say governments are evil. I think what that does, and like listen, assuming but not conceding, what this means is that if a technocratic government who is put at the time of the existing pandemic, when it is least popular, because that's where you maximize the effectivity of the OG model, that's when all of the hatred, a lot of the resentment as to why people are dying, why there's a lockdown, goes to the technocratic government. Why is that important? Look, a lot of these crises could have been preemptively prevented. Doing things like trying to fund healthcare, trying to fund or start the lockdown initially and proactively. Why does democratic politics only have that incentive on our side? Because you will be the government in place the moment that the pandemic starts. If you are not that government, you will do everything to shift the blame. You will say it was the technocratic government's fault. You will ask why they didn't tell you earlier. You will say that because they're the ones in power now, they have absolutely failed, and therefore it's not your fault. I think if you're the one who has to live through those policies and be in power, greater incentive to do a lot more of these things like fund healthcare and prevent future pandemics from being able to happen. I don't think they do that. So if we decrease the amount of future pandemics happening, a lot of the benefits of OG don't even matter because it means that they were non-issues from the very start. But lastly, I would say even after, it means you have the incentive to blame a lot of the existing harms like the slowdown economy on things like the technocratic government. That's particularly harmful. I think on our side, you still have the active incentive to work with them because you want smart policies that stop the disaster in order to ensure that you remain popular. On their side, you put them against each other because if you vie for re-election, you have to blame the previous government, and therefore you're much more likely to run on things like anti-science campaigns like Bolsonaro did and actively try to blame the technocratic government, even if there was some degree of success, or try to pin everything on saying that a lot of these scientific methods simply do not work and are absolute failures. I think the adversarial nature of this policy only destroys our ability to do anything and solve this issue. I'm very proud to oppose.
This House thanks the Leader of Opposition and acknowledges their speech, and hereby invites the Deputy Prime Minister to give their case.
All right, can everyone hear me? OCG.
This House calls upon the Deputy Leader of Opp to give their case. Cede.
Can I be heard?
Loud and clear.
I'll just... Three parts. The first is who is better at dealing with the crisis right now. Secondly, who is better at dealing with the crisis in the future. And thirdly, I will make a case that even if you believe the government as bench is better at solving public health crisis altogether, I honestly think that Mikko blew this debate in the hole and won it already. Even if you believe that, why in principle, we cannot trade off that because that is an assumption of the utilitarian value of solving public health crisis over everything else. So I will run a very principled case. But before that, the two issues I flagged earlier. So firstly, who is better at dealing with the crisis right now? So at no point in time do they really engage with the material coming from Mikko. Why there are a lot of times technocrats aren't that good. In developing countries, a lot of the technocrats come from elite people who are educated in university. That comes from the top 1%, people who are not akin to the needs of the poor individuals. Politicians, in comparison, are forced to campaign in the needs of the poor individuals. They have the resources to access these stories, and therefore a lot of times the policy guidelines are misguided. But let's assume they're omniscient. At no point in time do they really prove the accountability mechanism that technocrats are there. Technocrats are not gods. They are also people with their own incentives. What Mikko provides is, if there is only temporarily employed by the state for the time that the crisis does happen, then presumably after the crisis, they're going to be unemployed. And to a degree that you have a medical degree, or to a degree that you have a public policy or an analytic degree, where do you go then? Presumably a lot of these people go to the big pharmaceutical companies. They go to the different private hospitals because these are the only people willing to employ them or employ them at higher costs. This is important because a lot of the material coming from Mikko about why you then have an incentive to do things like prioritize the interests of private hospitals or do things like reinforce patents so you have good favor with a lot of these corporations still exist. And note that this is a crisis, right? So at no point in time can you be held accountable to these actions because we're uncertain what is the right solution according to Gov, and presumably can justify this by saying we need to trust private institutions. This is problematic not only for the spread of the healthcare problem, but also for the fact that even if they can do it at the same space, charging so much in private hospitals means people are economic, and that's a harm in and of itself. But thirdly, we would suggest, even if they are good at times, there is no mechanism to hold them accountable in instances that there's some people who are bad. That is the question of accountability that they missed out. What did they then say? The problem with Democrats is because structurally, quote unquote, they will never do anything that is unpopular. I want to analyze this now. I agree, it might be unpopular to do a shutdown, but I would also suggest millions of people dying in the United States or the UK because of not having a shutdown is also very, very unpopular for your government. So the question of unpopularity is likely to weigh in the minds of a lot of officials. They're not going to be elected just for today, they're also elected for tomorrow. So presumably they'd want to make sure they balance these interests out. But I want to deal with the worst case. Assuming it is so unpopular to make a shutdown, that's why government officials are unwilling to do so. Maybe there are legitimate reasons as to why a shutdown will be probably worse than a not shutting down at all. Maybe it's that, for instance, your entire economy is already in the brink of destruction. Any further shutdown would cause even greater crisis and greater more deaths because of poverty and hunger in comparison to the public health crisis. At no point in time did Gov say the shutdown is always the best thing to do at any particular point in time. And to a degree that's so unpopular, maybe the will of the people is correct and therefore we ought to follow it in those instances. But thirdly, at no point in time did they respond to the fact that let's assume that the general solution is quarantine. So in most public health crisis, you have to do a quarantine because you cannot solve it through things like vaccines because these things take like 18 months for you to be able to create. This is important because at no point did they explain why people will actually buy into the quarantine. So it's either under their side of the house. So Mikko gives you all the analysis for this, right? Politicians are more charismatic, they have the popularity of the people. And a lot of times technocrats themselves are unpopular because as we have proven, a lot of times you come from the private hospitals that charge you so much. They're the people who put you in debt. They're the people, the reason why you're poor. So a lot of times there is general hatred towards these technocrats. This is problematic because people are unlikely to follow a lot of the quarantines. It's either they do things like riots or just not report, for instance, because they don't believe in the government telling them that the solutions are correct. But secondly, to a degree, Gov says we will force them to follow. So you do things like militarize individuals or enforce through borders of militarization. This leads to even a larger host of problems. A lot of times this leads to riots or just the economic cost of having to fund all your soldiers to make sure people follow could have been money used by these politicians to care for a lot of the healthcare service providers that exist under our side. The more important part of the policy is not what the policy is. Generally, we agree it's quarantine, but how we implement this policy, and this is where politicians are better off, that government is not able to do under their said house. But let's assume they're better for the short term. In the long term, this is the analysis that Mikko was not responded by, which is if politicians have incentives right now, as Gov portrays, to care about popular welfare policies like giving money to people or just building infrastructure to create jobs, there is no incentive for them to make preemptive measures for healthcare policies. The reason for this is, under their side, at the point where there's a severe healthcare crisis, they are no longer responsible, and therefore they can blame the technocrats, and therefore have no incentive. The response coming from Adi was that opposition groups will blame technocrats right now, or blame the previous government. That is fine, because if they blame the previous government, they're held accountable to it. But they're under our side of the house, there's no mechanism to make sure that these people make a lot of these preemptive measures. This is important, because a lot of the crisis is not done because of the disease itself, but because your hospitals are inequipped with protection materials, or doing things like making sure you have enough healthcare for people, or making people healthcarely literate so they know what to do. All these things that politicians are costly, and therefore if they have no incentive to do so, they don't have to do so future health crises are worse. This is important because more future high health crises in the future have more harms than the crisis right now. Now I want to deal with my principle. So we would suggest, even if they deal with the health crisis better, that is one value that people might value. It is unclear why this is the most important value that people value. In fact, anything we construe as valuable, to a degree that the health crisis is valuable, is because we willed it to be valuable in the first place. I don't think government can make a claim that everyone cares about the health crisis as much as everyone else does. Why is this important? Because to a degree that we cannot ascertain, the fairest thing to do is to maintain some semblance of democracy to represent this will. The response coming from opening government was, well, we restrict rights in the state of emergency. Note the difference. Even in wartime, where there's a state of emergency, Winston Churchill or whoever the prime minister, whoever the public elected leader is still in charge. So you might be able to curtail rights, but the leader who has still a representative and knows about the interest of people is more important than anything else that exists under there for the house. That is why, even if you believe they solve the health crisis, they know why in principle this is more important than anything else. We are better for the healthcare system, but we are better at least for the interests of people, which I think this debate ought to boil down to. We're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
This was thanks to the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Apologizes for the distraction. We now invite the member here.
Am I audible? Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The assumption from both the opening government teams is that public opinion is either good or bad, but there was literally first no nuance as to how this public opinion will be generated, aside from like a little bit of layering of from opening government as to how this is like there's a lack of misinformation, there's misinformation or lack of information. But secondly, there's no consideration as to the nuances of other government incentives that often clash with public opinion or public will, and therefore will lead to these parties making wrong decisions. We'll cover that. First of all, the assumption that they're too reliant on public opinion. I think the problem with that is that in times of crisis, especially to do with new viruses, there are three structural problems. First of all, is the fact that this is extremely technical. This is science that most people do not understand. But secondly, because there's an ongoing research about a new pandemic, there are new ideas from like literally left and right, new research being done at every point in time. Therefore, you're not sure about what to believe in which case people often skew towards things that they believe personally believable, often like falling back upon their own biases. Thirdly, media taking advantage of this. That is, say, false information propagation. Political lobbyists using as a way to smear other parties and in order to get more political leverage. All these smear campaigns and all these things means that the information that people get is often skewed against what is objectively correct or what is objectively better for the people. Secondly, I think government has other incentives as well, which kind of clouds out the public opinion, even if that were good. How does that span out? First of all, parties have random political alliances, political ideologies. For instance, this party is anti-China, or that party is anti-USA, which means like a lot of good policies, or say good policies like taking aid, or say taking testing kits and like vaccines and etc. from corporations that exist in country X. You don't do that because you're just politically aligned against doing so. Secondly, compromising on some communities' health and well-being because you believe that they are not the most important voter bases for yourself. So, for instance, many countries trying to attain herd immunity or compromising on some like groups because you believe that they're not politically loud enough. Thirdly, even if the greatest incentive is to be re-elected, I think there's a nuance in what that re-election incentive looks like. You don't take the most rational decision as to how much stimulus to give. Rather, what you do is we don't need to solve the crisis, but we need to look like we're doing enough. That is say people see pandemics as incurable, so it's easier to avoid scrutiny by just showing that you're trying to do enough. But second, it's often easier to just blame it on other countries as being the ones that are spreading the virus, or WHO not giving you enough aid, or all those kinds of things. Thirdly, you don't do things like financing R&D of vaccines enough, even though that would be good, because it's hard to rip the benefits off of those kinds of things. Three reasons for that. First of all, the benefits attained, those benefits are often attained in the long term. Therefore, it's hard to sell that as your party's greatest win. Secondly, often you have to finance international organizations or like international bodies, and it's hard to show that you are the greatest reason why WHO could do this and use that as a selling point for your people. Thirdly, a lot of R&D organizations choose to not disclose donors, especially in the times of crisis, because they do not want to take the liability of like any kind of like failures and etc. Which means it's very hard to sell the R&D success as your greatest point. Thirdly, the reason why political gridlocks and hanging governments works is because there's a massive partisan divide within Congress. Politicians are too ideologically motivated to find a balance between, say, economic interests and healthcare interests, and therefore, whatever decision you come to becomes a little too late. Conclusion: not objectively best decisions being taken. In response to opening opposition, these people have purpose, like technocrats have purpose incentives. They're often elites from like the top 1%. I think they massively misunderstand how there exists a balance. When these technocratic governments are created, you have like people from surely the corporations, but you also have people from, say, WHO, other health organizations, academicians and economists whose CV as a technocrat relies on that technocracy's success. I think it's wrong to say that like Stiglitz, who writes books on how to solve poverty and the perils of poverty, it's untrue to say that he doesn't understand poverty and just cares about getting more money. Apart from all of this, opening opposition says that this set of people have wrong incentives and politicians have better incentives. Even if that were true, I think the mech for that incentive is still absent. So even if they have better incentives, they don't have the capacity to make good decisions. The reason for that being people's opinions and people's public will is not manifested in the best fashion because of our early analysis of how information is generated in these times. Secondly, corporate interests are not necessarily horrible. They want economic protection, which is good for everyone, but corporate wants that as well. Secondly, you don't want to lose workers or consumers because they're too sick to be unable to consume or work in your offices. Thirdly, corporate image nowadays is often reliant on whether or not you're able to solve crisis, as opposed to you can exacerbate it, because that used to be the reason why banks often suffered after the Great Recession. Before I move on, opening opposition.
So the argument that there is political deadlock is a wash, because under your side, the model had multiple organizations and multiple different technocrats who are still likely to disagree with one another, and therefore potential deadlock from the delays is value neutral.
Correct. We're willing to take that cost of that time off because we believe that those people have better access to information, and will, even with time, they'll come to better decisions as opposed to, say, time you waste on political gridlocks ultimately coming to bad decisions. Secondly, the first time we'll give you a proper framing for the principle here. Why do we allow democracy? It's because free will is needed to evaluate what utility you want. Dictators should not impose a certain set of utilities on you. Why does this free will not matter here? First of all, the cost is humongous. Lives are at stake. But secondly, multiple generations of people in the future who did not consent to the government or policies will have to live with the perils of a virus that was not cured. But secondly, the assumption is that free will exists in democracies otherwise during these times. It is absolutely untrue. 3 reasons why. For instance, firstly, some groups of people will be incessantly locked out of power and policies against their choice will be endorsed. Poor people in certain industries that the state is willing to sacrifice and their economic concerns will be sacrificed. Those people will be continuously locked out of that power. Secondly, economic protection is so strongly contradictory to public health that even if you prioritize one over the other, very good chance that the policy will completely go against you. It's hard to find a balance in between those two sets of utilities, and therefore it's unlikely that your free will be manifested in any meaningful way. Thirdly, when the government was elected, coronavirus was not an issue, and you did not vote taking that into consideration. Therefore, it's untrue that the politician that you have in the Congress right now will necessarily vote on or will make policies based on what you want. Rather, they're more likely to make policies based on what their political ideologies or political motives are reliant on. Therefore, politicians act in terms of their political motives, which does not necessarily align with that of people. The conclusion is twofold here. Firstly, free will is an instrument to attain utility. You lose out on the utility. Bare free will, which is just an instrument, has no value. Secondly, free will is non-existent on their side of the house as well. Democracy is therefore meaningless on their side of the house, and therefore technocracy, which is utilitarianly the best way to solve this crisis, is the best way to go. Very proud to propose.
This House thanks a member of government for their extension, acknowledges it, and invites a member of opposition to give their extension.
Am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think OG is out of this debate because CG does a better job of things. So the first part of my speech will be dealing with the pragmatic part of CG case. The second thing I'll talk about is how the system is likely to be abusive and not likely to lead to the proper outcomes. Third, I'll talk about why democratic governments in most cases can be held accountable, will lead to good decisions. Then I'll talk about why health is not an a priori moral concern. Lastly, I'll talk about the most vulnerable context and why democratic governments are the only way to solve problems there. Firstly, people don't understand, they're dumb, they make really bad decisions. That was the pragmatic part of CG case. 4 responses. Number 1, the OG model, which you cannot contradict because of debating rules, tells you that the only time intervention happens is when this problem is serious already. At this point in time, whether or not people are concerned or not does not matter, because they can see deaths happening in front of them and they can visualize what the impact of this health crisis is. So it is unfair for you to think that a poor person doesn't understand what the child that he's losing means to that person. That's really elitist from CG. Secondly, this applies to almost anything: economic policy, foreign policy. Like, people are just dumb, but we still have democratic elections. Why not just have technocratic governments all the time, forever? Third, they ignore the nuance of most governments. These are not places where we're having elections now where they're going to vote on the policy. The nuance is that rather deadlocks likely to happen in their case as well. So the marginal loss of time and the marginal loss of response by virtue of this people being dumb thing is really morally redundant. First part of the case broken. Secondly, why is the system likely to be abusive? 3 structural reasons under this. Number 1, when you have an organization like the UN or the WHO implementing this in literally every single country in the world, they're likely to see this as a global concern and use this to influence the global pandemic. What this means is they're likely to see the entire world as a KPI that needs to be fixed. So the concerns and the criteria are not going to be how much has Bangladesh improved, it's more likely to be how much has Asia improved. And in a world where we already have massive influence of developed countries on these organizations, the most vulnerable countries with the least political capital are likely to be left behind. Secondly, the technocrats appointed are also likely to be international, because poor countries like Africa have very few technocrats that can take over and run an entire country. So most of these governments are likely to be actual researchers from America who actually don't understand the day-to-day concerns of what life in Africa means. Thirdly, I think O touches on this, which is technocrats have their own careers to look after. But the more important part of this is the only KPI they have is how quickly they can stop the virus from spreading. This means that removes all other accountability because they can do something in finance called a big bath, where they justify lack of fiscal stimulus, lack of any financial concern, because they have that one KPI they need to meet. As a doctor, you don't give a shit if the economy falls if you can justify it on an external circumstance. The three structural reasons show to you that the reason why current governments are failing are going to get increasingly worse when you have this system. Why are democratic governments likely to be held accountable? 4 reasons. Number 1, recognize this problem affects everyone. It is a threat to the elites. It is a threat to politicians. Boris Johnson has this. All Premier League players are suffering from a risk of it. This is not something that you can restrict to the poor and therefore ignore. Even the people you pander to have a risk of dying. I'm sure they're afraid of not wanting to die. Secondly, we think electoral cycles mean that they have to justify things like why they did not have the proper funding. Why did they not have proper preemptive measures? Thirdly, severity and scrutiny of media is likely to be at an all-time objective high, especially when it comes to this concern. This is not just domestic media. On an additional layer, it's international media. We're looking at literally every country in the world and how they're responding. The evidence and illustration for this is most good governments have severe crisis despite no fault of their own. Can you pinpoint what Canada did wrong? Can you pinpoint what Australia did wrong? Can you pinpoint what Spain did wrong? No, most of these countries had proper policies. The reason why the coronavirus still spread was because it's an international cross-border crisis. Implementing a government that prioritizes international concerns is not going to solve that. In such a situation of desperation, democratic governments themselves want to be that guy that helps their country and does not leave the vulnerable behind. That's the second part, and this probably deals with OG pushback of you have to give a reason to solve the problem. Third, health is not a principal or a priori concern. 3 layers under this. Number 1, on a macro level, we don't always prioritize health, which goes on to show why a lot of countries don't have massive health budgets, or climate change is not an a priori concern in every single country in the world. On a micro level, we allow things like individual treatment. What kind of treatment you want at a point of death? Do you want something to reduce pain? Do you want something to extend life? What exactly is it that you want? Third, we also think that health crisis and death are not always equally morally culpable. So coronavirus has like huge spreading rates, but death rates are like 3% or 4%. So they cannot claim that all people are going to die because a lot of people just suffer from mild symptoms while losing their jobs because their governments are shut down, which shows health is not an a priori moral concern. What are a priori moral concerns that can apply on a counterbalance? I think OG is out of this debate. I'll take a CGPI if you have. Things like poverty that need fiscal stimulus have moral concerns. Yeah, CGPOI.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Literally everything you said that you can scrutinize, you can justify later on are reactive policy, which means at best you come after a really long time with your solutions when things have already gone too bad.
Yes, but OG model is you will only do this when things have gone too bad. You cannot contradict their model, man. Unfortunate for you, but that's how debating rules work. So I think what you need to justify is why any other alternative a priori moral concern, like poverty, like living with your children, like giving them food, is not a concern that has to operate. So I don't see a principle justification. This deals with the latter part of Jubayer's speech where he talks about principal cases. The most developing countries where things are like really unruly, there's only one way to stop this from happening. Active fear, using the military, threatening violence, making sure people stay in their homes. That's what's happening in countries like Rwanda, Bangladesh, India. The only time individuals are going to respond to these things positively is when they know that the government doing it has been given consent at some point in time. There is no general structural policy that can solve the problems of these developing countries. They don't have money. They don't have any other ability to stop. We think these are the most vulnerable countries where the harshest measures have to be used. The only government that can justify it is a government elected by the people. Very glad to oppose.
This House acknowledges the member for next one, and now invites the government whip to give the final speech of
Can you all hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I didn't expect this to be so easy to beat CO because of one single POI. I think what they misunderstand is OG painted a picture that is bleak due to COVID-19. They never claimed you will only form this government, the point at which there is no return, which means that in the face of it, their initial response to this means that all of their reactive policy already incurs huge amounts of harm, which means every mistake in policy, every person who accidentally dies due to the crisis is in their head, and they must take responsibility for this in the op bench, specifically CO, for their really, really shitty response. Even if this was true, we think the situation can always get worse, in which case you will still be reactive, which means on both of those grounds, I don't think they answer all of the liability for all of the people they end up hurting on opposition side. Now, what am I going to do in this speech? First, I'll discuss the entire MEG that we presented and why the responses from CO were quite shallow in comparison. Second, I'll discuss with the broad principle idea. And thirdly, about the effectiveness of these individuals. The first of which, now to discuss whether this is bad. So what Sajid's claim again is premised on the fact that it's already too serious. What we say here is that it is not the fact that it is too serious that is the concern of these people, but about knowing how to solve it that is the concern with us in terms of making policy, which is why when you are presented with a couple of decisions which are both very complex, it is not in the position just to know that things are bad for you to be able to decide. It is rather the opposite. When you know things are so bad, you are panicking, you are losing family members, you are losing all of your jobs. At that point, you are in the worst possible position to make those decisions in the first place. So when they claim that it is already too serious or people already make decisions, they're not always facing crises as such. They're not always facing novel problems which researchers are struggling to deal with. They are not struggling with false information to this level, which is why we tell you that these decisions are likely to be ones which are not properly informed and thereby not good decisions. That was the premise. Therefore, the decisions are generally not good. The second thing we argued, no often cannot end up scrutinizing on government or donate to WHO to solve a global crisis. So when they don't engage with these things, which means we assume their government is restricted to other actions which are generally reactive and therefore at best mitigate damages, do not solve problems. The only thing they tell us responses are, they're going to be very oppressive because it's WHO, this turn. Well, if your KPI is solving COVID-19, maybe letting the letting the millions of people die in Bangladesh because they're poor isn't your solution. So really, to meet your KPI, you must ensure death tolls are low. To ensure KPI, you must ensure the disease is actually solved. Unlike politicians who can easily trade off a few people or even 49% of the goddamn people and their interests, because that is how their incentives work. We think that if you look at the kinds of accountability to these both entities, you have a significantly higher degree of accountability to the incentives of this entire committee. The last problem they then identify in terms of political gridlocks, and I'm going to kind of explain the technocracy process because this is a lot of confusion here. First thing, deadlocks are unlikely to be as much because these are all individuals who are experts in their field, academicians, researchers, and people who actually know how to work in crisis moments. Therefore, they're able to not have as contrasting agenda when they all want to solve a common problem. But then they say that, oh, even if they have the ability to solve, which essentially proves that deadlocks are less likely here, we save time, their governments take more time every day, adding more death toll. But then the comparison they push is that these individuals are not capable of making these decisions because they are elite. Few problems here. One, who worked in public health. They're often researchers. They're people who worked on the ground. That's their entire job description. How are they so elite to not understand the problems on the ground? Even if you assume this is true, it is irrelevant because they need to solve a global crisis which has nothing to do with what the poor people specifically want here. We recognize some of those interests are traded off, but you do that every single day when 40% of the people are a minority in a democracy. So really, you have no unique harm to these people. Which really, for all of those reasons, then the decisions are likely to be better on our side, are quicker on our side, but on their side, your shutdown is not done until it is too fucking late. And that was the initial problem we presented with this in the first place, which means they need to concede the delay and the lack of good decisions mean they will actively justify losing that many lives. The last thing then that becomes important in this debate is, so what have we proven in CG thus far? We've proven to you the specific mechanisms which makes the decision bad, which makes the decision delayed and unstrategic, all of which then mean the problem is not solved, which no op team has essentially showed you as a neck as to why it will be solved. But then we showed you why technocrats are in the best position to actually solve this problem. The last thing that then can be argued is in terms of whether we can take this right of democracy and freedom away. We specifically argued why free will is an instrument for utility where it doesn't exist in this case anymore. Sajid says some people's lives going a bit worse and getting some cough isn't bad enough. Well, everyone in the entire world is afraid. Everyone in the entire world is having a terrible time, and some people are actually losing lives. All of those we think are utilitarian losses you must consider: the loss of life and death, and the loss of ability to do everything else, because your ability to practice any kind of freedom in a position of paranoia is limited. Therefore, your basic freedom is always curtailed so long as this crisis pursues. Therefore, you cannot essentially claim the bigger right here is to protect those other things, especially if you're not solving the problem itself. What then did we talk about? We said that democracy in itself cannot cater to these individuals because there are specific must defend. Leaders specifically cannot care for everyone, so they pick one or the other. The best thing about the technocracy is there is no moral position in the first place, which is why there is no problem with you having a decision that overall does greater good. The conclusion then becomes, if the consideration of losing democracy is that other things were an a priori right, there is no guarantee of any of those, rather a further detriment to all of those in the world of opposition. We uniquely have guaranteed that at the very least we're taking the best measures to solve all of those problems. Before I proceed,
So on our side, you can still have effective policies because these are assumably popular and therefore can consult. But you change this relationship to be adversarial, the point in which these are the same people who will take you away from power and you can blame because they're in power during the severe epidemic.
Okay, I have a very funny response to O in many ways. Like, the first thing I want to say is that their assumption for why this situation will arise is when the technocracy fails, and then you must blame someone. We say the technocracy will succeed. On their side, nobody succeeds, so you have a blame game all the time. On our side, if the technocracy does not fail or shows any amount of progress, you will be on the side of science in terms of your future policy. That's something that they never essentially consider. It's just creating a sort of blame game environment which doesn't arise in the first place. A couple of more responses to OO. They claim that, there are corporate interests. We tell you, well, the worst case is if there is a corporate interest, we will ensure that there is at least the spread of healthcare and the proper solving of this. But best of all, we ensure that the bulk of the root level problems are solved with these technocrats, which these governments can never do because they don't overhaul systems. Proud to propose.
Thank you, Government Whip. Speech acknowledges it, sorry, and invites the opposition to take this.
Am I audible?
end of the debate, I asked all teams to cross forwards and shake hands virtually in the Grand Auditorium and await our discussion. We'll be deliberating in the discussion room 101. We'll be back within a reasonable amount.
The discussion room for this?
101.